Welcome to Living One. I am your host, Olivia Crossman. Living One is Kerulos' monthly webinar series, now in its fifth year. With guest speakers from around the world, we listen into how people are bringing their ethics, minds, and lives into alignment with nature for earth and animal liberation and revitalization. We ask the question, we know what's wrong, but what does right look like? Most importantly, how do we get from wrong to right? When there is so much to change and heal, where do we begin? What's the first step? What is the path each of us can undertake to make positive, deep, transformative change, not only as individuals, but as a collective whole? What is ours to do? Let's talk about it. This year, Living One hosts and hears from individuals who have forged a range of unique and inspiring paths to help transform and heal Earth, animals, and human society. Join us for another year of rich conversations to learn how, individually and in community, we can take the necessary, concrete, timely steps towards a right world, a world of peace and wellness for all Earth beings. Our guest today is Mary Watkins. Mary is a liberation psychologist and a Professor Emerita at Pacifica Graduate Institute, where she co-founded the Community Liberation, Indigenous and Eco-Psychologies graduate program. She is the author of many books, including Towards Psychologies of Liberation and Mutual Accompaniment and the Creation of the Commons. What does the dehumanization of those enslaved in the US have to do with animal and earth rights? Using as starting points her ancestral history from the American South, Watkins has been taking deep dives into the history of slavery and the Jim Crow era. In this talk, she addresses three interlinked processes: dehumanization born of white supremacy, the creation of racial and species hierarchies, and the commodification of the natural world. In the spirit of this series that hosts unique and inspiring paths to help transform and heal Earth, animals, and human society, we will look to alternate processes that restore the dignity of all living beings. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that we are all currently on various Indigenous lands. I am currently on the ancestral homelands of the Council of the Three Fires, which includes the Ojibwa, Ottawa, and Potawatomi. This land exists also as a place of trade with other Indigenous communities, including the Ho-Chunk, Miami, Menominee, Sauk, and Meskwaki. The Kerulos Center for Nonviolence is located on the homelands of the grizzly bear, takelma, daku coyote, coho salmon, golden eagle, and gray wolf. Finally, we ask that all of us participate with full respect and attention to each other in the spirit of peace and wisdom that Living One seeks to foster. So without further ado, we welcome Mary Watkins.
Thank you, Olivia, and thank you both, Olivia and Gabe, for inviting me to share some of what I'm working on now. So I'm going to just dive right in. So for the last 4 years, I've been working on looking at my own ancestral history with relationship to enslavement in the American South. And I began not knowing anything past my great-grandfather, but pretty soon realized that my ancestors went all the way back to 1608, the second year of the founding of Jamestown, and that they had a very, very long intergenerational relationship with chattel slavery. So I want to share with you today a few of the things that I've discovered that I think are very timely, actually, to the situations that we're in now in the United States. And the first has to do with the first 100 years in the Virginia colony. When people came from, by the way, the book that I'm just finishing now is called White War, Racial Reckoning and Reparations. So I'm trying to look at, what is the work that white people need to do to be able to join in solidarity with racial reparations. So when English people came to Jamestown, they weren't white. They didn't use the terminology of white. They were Christians and they were English. They did have a history of hierarchy. Beginning in the 1200s, there was this process, as you probably know, of enclosure in England of the gentry, the noble people, beginning to literally put fences around areas where the people who were working the land in community with each other, put fences around it so that they could no longer get into the land that they were farming. And they were farming with a particular ethic, which had to do with taking what they needed, but not taking more than what they needed, and often stinting so that others who needed the food could go back and glean and get food for their family. So there was a reciprocal relationship with the land going. But particularly in the 1500s, as more and more people were forced off the land, they landed in the urban areas and were taken up into the beginnings of industrialization. Those who could get jobs, those who couldn't get jobs fell into prison, into almshouses, and indentured servitude. Indentured servitude was a process of really selling yourself for 7 years, usually 7 years. I mean, there would be a contract, um, and with the hope that you could gain some skills and some livelihood after that. Many of those indentured people and prisoners and poor people came to Jamestown and to Virginia, but they brought with them this hierarchy really based on economics, but not based on race and not based on color. And so I began to wonder, well, how did how did we become white after all? And why did we, those of us who identify with being white, how and why did this happen? So as you know, as you probably, well, I was really inspired by um, a woman, a scholar activist named Aurora Levins Morales. She was born into a family with roots in Spanish Harlem and also in Puerto Rico. And in her later adulthood, she discovers that her family in Puerto Rico, despite her growing up thinking she was mainly related to Spanish Harlem, her family in Puerto Rico had enslaved people for generations. And so she begins to write about an alternative to racism, what she calls raícism. Right, raíces is the Spanish word for roots. A quote from her. Raícism is the practice of rooting ourselves in the real concrete histories of our people, our families, our local communities. It is radical genealogy, history made personal. It's a keeping of accounts. Its intent is to pierce the immense, mind-deadening denial that permeates daily life, that grounds our deepest grief and horror about the founding and ongoing atrocities of racism, class, and patriarchy. Racism rootedness, she says, is the choice to bear witness to our specific, contradictory historical identities in relationship to one another. It's an account of the debts and assets we have inherited, and acknowledging that the precise nature of that inheritance is an act of spiritual and political integrity. So, as you may know, in 1619, the first Africans arrived to Virginia on the White Lion. They were, nobody was using, in Virginia, nobody was using the word slave at that point, but there was no getting around the fact that they had been kidnapped and coerced by threat of life to get there. They were Ndongos who had been kidnapped and trafficked from what we call now Gambia, actually from the urban areas of Gambia. And they were bought by Governor Yardley in exchange for food and supplies. They were in the language that was used at that point, they were integrated into a language of indenturement, but their indenturement was quite unlike that the English settlers were enjoying. For instance, if they were ever freed, and there were very few who were ever freed, they had served for a longer term of indenturement. If they were listed on rosters, they were listed at the bottom with the commodities, not with the other indentured people. When they were listed usually without any names or sometimes with only a first name. So they might be listed something like Negro Men 3. Um, they also had no date of their arrival. So with without a date of their arrival on these rosters, there was no way to determine what would be the date of their freedom potentially. And in fact, unlike the English indentured people, they had no contract, no set contract. So in fact, the people um, who to whom they were indentured, quote unquote, had no legal necessity to let them free at any point. And we begin to see from the time they arrived until the end of the 1600s, gradually putting into place the Virginia General Assembly, putting into place a series of laws that began to create a hierarchy that was not just economic, but racial. And I'll just go through some of the laws that will give you a sense of what it meant to create, out of people who are who are people, um, a hierarchy of value that then allowed many atrocities to those deemed at the end of the hierarchy and placed alongside animals, which is the link to um, Kerulos. In 1620, Africans and Native Americans were called in the census non-Christians in the service of the English. So again, not discriminated in terms of color, but here in terms of not being Christian. And the English had brought some uneasiness about people from Africa. They didn't really know them. They hadn't lived alongside them, but they had a sense of cultural superiority that was um, that was there, though rather inarticulated. In 1640, John Punch, an African, was given a different and more severe punishment for running away than an indentured English servant would have been given. While if you were English and indentured and you ran away, you would be given an additional 4 years of servitude. But Punch was given indenturement for life. And this was a punishment that had never been given to an indentured person, let alone to a settler. In 1643, a law made African women tithable or taxable, which was a way of placing them in a category along with livestock and property. This is another step in terms of formalizing them not as indentured servants, but as something more like animals and property. In 1646, the English signed an agreement with the Powhatans that when indentured English ran away and wanted to live with the Powhatans, they could stay. But if a person of African descent went to stay with the Powhatans agreed to return them to their servitude. In 1660, a Virginia law was passed to discourage white indentured servants from escaping with Africans. It said that when apprehended, the Negroes could not be punished by serving more time, an indication that everybody was kind of agreeing that they were serving as much time as they possibly could, lifelong. Like in 1662, there was a real shift in English law, which ordinarily had children take the status of their father. So if the father was free, the child was free. But this, this law made slavery inheritable by proclaiming the status of a newborn follows the status of the mother. So from that point on, all children with enslaved mothers became the property of the mother's owner. And the terms used to refer to the women were Negroes and heathens. This meant now that those who were enslaving had access to generation after generation of unpaid laborers. In 1667, the Assembly passed an act declaring that the baptism of those who were serving their indentured servitude would not exempt them from bondage. Now, this was a really important moment because um, the main distinction that the English had been making up to that point was, are you Christian or not Christian? And of course, they were associating non-Christian with people of African descent. But now they were importing um, people of African descent and Africans from the Caribbean who had been baptized. I mean, they knew that in the Bible, it was said that a Christian should not um, enslave another Christian. So they were at a real a point of decision about how were they going to distinguish those they wanted to continue to exploit and dominate. And in 1667, we see for the first time the word slave appear in these laws. It's no longer linked with being non-Christian, it's linked with color. 2 years later, there's an act passed that says if you are an enslaver and somebody you are enslaving has resisted you or your overseer or your wife, you can discipline and even kill them without it being a felony. So this gave enslavers license to commit the most extreme violence against those enslaved without any legal repercussion to themselves. There were many, many laws passed, but I'll just tell you one more. In 1680, um, they began to really legislate that people who were enslaved could not move off the plantation where they worked without a written note. If they did so, even if they were, going to going to go hunting or something like that, they could be punished. All gatherings were banned. Um, the enslavers were quite afraid of insurrections, and they were afraid that if people gathered, they would begin to plan them. So when people of African descent wanted to pray together, they would go far into swamps or into the woods, into what were called hush harbors, often covering their heads with a pot as they prayed or sang so that they would be undetected. A curfew was put into place, banning people from moving at night. Um, so you see this circumscription that that happens. People were unable to carry a club, a staff, a gun, a sword, or any weapon that could bounce off them. And they began to lay out the kinds of punishments for these various things that were now deemed offensive. Um, Pretty soon, interracial marriage was prohibited. And if a white woman who was free did have a child by somebody of color, she was often placed into servitude herself, and her child was bound into servitude for 30 years. So we see here that the Europeans came to look down on people of African descent, seeing them as barbarians, as non-Christians, as really belonging to an inferior and a different race. They were sometimes talked about as having a different kind of being altogether. Some settlers viewed Africans as descended from a black Ham, not from Adam and Eve, separating their ancestral lineage from that of Africans. Some thought that Africans were formed from debris left by the Great Flood or as descendants from some of the creatures on Noah's Ark. Still others thought they were the progeny of the devil. And more disturbing was their conviction that African descended people were really not human at all. They might look like humans, but they were really more like non-human animals. At times, people even said things like, they weren't human, but they were not altogether animal either. They were something quite different. Um, so being white now, we can see people were not thinking of themselves now as primarily English, as Christian, as Irish, as Scots, but they were joining in solidarity across these various differences into being white. And that whiteness was completely linked with racial hierarchy and with hierarchy also vis-a-vis animals, as we'll see. So one of the problems that we have in beginning to think beyond hierarchy and beginning to think beyond whiteness is how to delink white supremacy from whiteness, since its roots, since it shares the very same root. Take a break for a moment. So the next step in my research was looking at my ancestors moved from Virginia, where I found out that some of them had turned Quakers. And then I found out that some of the people who had turned Quakers actually enslaved people. That surprised me. And so I wrote a chapter on the 100 years before Quakers were abolitionists, when they were also slave traffickers and enslavers, and how they were able to live with the contradiction of their testimonies of equality and simplicity, and while enslaving other human beings. But I want to jump to the next chapter, where my ancestors moved to what is now northern North Carolina. And I wanted to get a sense of how the people who were enslaved, how they saw white people. So I spent quite a lot of time reading all the slave narratives I could from North Carolina. And one of the many things I was struck by was the the people who had been enslaved, who were now writing, and who were also, some of whom were interviewed by the Public Works Administration during the Depression, talked about how they were literally dehumanized by their enslavers. And, you know, of course, I knew the term dehumanization, but until I read these narratives, I didn't realize how concrete dehumanization was in terms of the way that people were and are actually treated when they are likened to animals. So these are some of the ways that came out of these narratives. People complaining that they were fed coarse food, the kind of food that would be given to the livestock. Not only fed coarse food, but it was put in animal troughs, and they had to eat out of it like animals. They were denied adequate shelter and clothing. They were restricted in their movements, as in pens. They saw their labor as not for themselves, but for their owners, and they were controlled and disciplined through violence and terror. Once dehumanized, the enslavers branded, corralled, chained, bred, coddled, sold, and, quote, managed the enslaved through means of brute force, like they would their livestock. Slaves were seen as just another beast of burden. Many of the narrators describe themselves as being treated like animals by white overseers. Boast, formerly enslaved, described how a strong young man who was being auctioned in a slave market was advertised as a mule. Benjamin, Harriet Jacobs' brother, before trying to run away, said to his sister, "Linda, we are dogs here, footballs, cattle, everything that's mean. No, I will not stay. Let them bring me back. We don't die but once." Women often had to give birth in the fields like the cows done, said Lucy Brown of Person County, North Carolina. When Boast observed groups of enslaved being herded to a slave auction, he said they were made to run, quote, just like droves of turkeys running along in front of them horses. In the winter, he observed ice balls hanging off the bottom of women's dresses as they were forced to, quote, run along just like sheep in a pasture for they are sheared, as they were taken to slave auctions. On these long marches, the, quote, speculators stayed in the hotel and put the enslaved in the quarters just like droves of hogs. One hotel guest recalled, all through the night I could hear them mourning and praying. I didn't know the Lord would let people live who were so cruel. Raina Raines, born in Wake County, North Carolina, recalled how her mother's master fed the children out of a trough as though they were hogs. Clara Jones recounted, I remember seeing them carrying sleighs in droves like cows. Dave Larson, enslaved in Granville, told how the slave trafficker felt a woman's arms and legs like she might have been a horse as he sized her up before selling her. So, um, very disturbingly, you have to ask, well, how did people who are doing this kind of these dehumanizing practices, how did they pass them along to their children such that slavery could continue across the generations? And I'm drawing from a book by Stephanie Jones Rogers called They Were Her Property. And in this book, if you ever have the sense of thought that maybe women enslaving families felt differently than their husbands, she dispels this by giving innumerable examples of the kind of brutality that women enacted on their domestic on those who worked in their house as domestic slaves. But more chillingly, how these women passed along these practices to their children. She describes a little girl, Lizzie Ann Burwell, from Linesville area in North Carolina. Lizzie loved flowers and often strolled through her parents' garden with Fanny, the enslaved woman charged with her care. After spending so much time with Fanny, Lizzie Anna developed an intense bond with her. But one day, Lizzie Anna became vexed with Fanny, so she went to her father and demanded that he cut Fanny's ears off and get her, Lizzie Anna, a new maid from Clarksville. Lizzie Anna was 3 years old. During those walks through the garden, and perhaps while observing her parents interact with the enslaved people around them, Lizzie Anna was learning how to be a slave owner. She was coming to understand the obscene logic that made it perfectly acceptable to enjoy the company of her enslaved caretaker in one moment and threaten to mutilate her or buy another slave to take her place the next. In the comfort of her home, she was recognizing that she possessed the power to command others to do just as she wished. At times when the mistresses of the house were beating a, a woman who was working there as a slave, she would turn the whip over to the child and encourage them to continue until blood ran down their legs. Moses Roper, in his slave narrative, shared, it didn't matter whether the child was large or small. They always beat you until the blood ran down. Sarah Alston, a North Carolina enslaver, wrote to her little grandson, whom she had a carriage built, quote, I reckon it will take all your little waiting men to pull it, unless you hitch the old gray. So she's referring to the the situation where often as soon as a white child was born into an enslaving family, they were gifted with enslaved children their own age, and they grew up playing with those children and then becoming their masters or mistresses. So this grandmother is imagining her grandson hitching all the little Black children around him up to this carriage to pull him. And indeed, some of the children would have seen their parents taking an enslaved man and substituting him for a horse or a mule to pull a wagon or carriage in order to shame him in a process of punishment. Frederick Law Olmsted, whom we know as creating Central Park, had this interesting job with the New York Times during the Civil War, where he kind of went incognito into the South and wrote articles back to the New York Times. And he would visit with slaveholders, witness what was going on in their households, and then write about it. And in this article, he said he was in the home of a large slaveholder. We heard the planter's 8-year-old son whipping his puppy behind the house. The boy said, "I've got an account to settle with you." He shouted this as he berated his puppy. "I've let you go on about this long enough. I'll teach you who's your master." His father came out, at first reprimanding him for cussing. But the boy defended himself by saying he was cussing out at the puppy just as his father did to those who were working for him. So that there are many examples, but that will give you a sense of the way in which this racialized hierarchy and the practices associated with keeping it in place were passed on. And beyond the utter misery that this caused to those who were enslaved, it also caused extreme kinds of psychopathology in individuals, families, and communities of those who were involved in enslaving. And I'm going to have Olivia attach an article I wrote that really goes through these pathologies in some great detail, because I think that they have bled down to us in white culture. And in fact, we see them in our political discourse quite a lot at the moment. And I'll refer to a few of them. Pathological narcissism, which in essence means degrading others to elevate yourself. Elevating yourself, feelings of grandiosity, of entitlement, of the license to exploit and dominate because of your superiority over others, an exaggerated sense of your own importance, occupation with fantasies of unlimited success, power, and brilliance, expecting and in fact demanding from others excessive admiration and deference, and feeling special and unique. Unfortunately, these elevated senses of oneself are completely based on a fiction that's rooted in racial hierarchy. And underneath that, a person may feel mediocre and inadequate, as Albert Memmi pointed out, with reference to colonizers. But to the extent that one does, one doubles down on brutality with respect to others. And one of the really striking features is an absence of empathy for anybody deemed beneath one. And so there's also an absence of a sense of moral injury. And by moral injury, I mean, let's say you might feel a sense of shame for having beaten somebody. But if you have no empathy with them, if you believe them to be the kind of being that must be disciplined, and that in fact, you're disciplining them is really a gift to them. You're teaching them a Protestant ethic of work. you're teaching them a, a very different form of Christianity that completely excises out any sense of exodus and liberation. These are things we heard in the Florida campaign, this sense from Ron DeSantis that slavery was a gift to people because it helped them develop crafts and occupations that they could then use once they were kind of logic. And along with pathological narcissism, in the slaveholding families, we see excessive paranoia, which caused them to tighten the vise on enslaved people. A sure sense of hypocrisy in terms of Christian values, and tendency for authoritarian character. Um, just a little bit about this that comes from Eric Fromm. He describes some of the components of authoritarian character that I think will sound familiar to us. Um, People with authoritarian character have an intense desire to control, hurt, and humiliate. They're excessively narcissistic, preoccupied with their own thoughts, feelings, and needs. They're malignantly aggressive and revengefully destructive. They exhibit conspicuous consumption in an attempt to fill a sense of an empty self. They prefer rigid social hierarchies and place their own group in a superior position, devaluing and dehumanizing others. Um, Now, what did African Americans do with being placed um, in the realm of animals? And of course, white English Christians not conceiving of themselves as animals at all, completely cut off from animals. Well, um, I've learned a lot from reading Nora Zia Hurston, who was an anthropologist and a folklorist. And she talks about how people from Africa brought a very rich tradition of folklore with regard to animals, and often a sense of animals is quite imbued with different sorts of spirituality. And when they came to this new world, um, they were placed in the care of animals and uh, continued with a sense of empathy toward them and respect for them. They saw them as intelligent beings, as spiritual beings, and in their folklore, which you can access through this beautiful and interesting and also humorous book, Mules and Men, where Kirsten went back to Florida, to Eatonville, Florida, where she'd grown up, and she hangs around the people she grew up with and writes down all the stories that they're telling each other constantly all day long. And in those stories, animals are the heroes. They're the ones who are very witty, very humorous. They can outfox the people who are trying to dominate them and control them. They teach um, how to survive in the face of um, people debasing you, and how to fly under the radar of white surveillance, so that um, it, the Africans were able to really make kin with animals and not only have literal relationships with them, but to have them become symbolic of the things which they were really striving for: freedom, survival, and resilience. So, how do white people make kin? Well, the problem that I'm trying to point to here is that um, those of us who are white stretch ourselves so far up a set of hierarchies of species and animals that that the first drop is to really understand the way in which whiteness is linked to racial hierarchy. And in doing that, to recover historical memory so that we have a sense of what kind of repair is owed. Because before you can become kin with a group of people, you have to acknowledge the harm that was done. And you have to not only apologize for it, um, but you have to make sure that you're never going to repeat that harm. You have to understand the harms, make sure you're never going to repeat them, and then offer to be involved in restitution and reparations, in repair. And in fact, the UN talks about these as conditions of reparation: cessation, non repetition, restitution, compensation, rehabilitation. So it's a kind of a long way around some of these first steps toward our being able to work our way out of hierarchies, which in the end always punish those at the bottom, but deform those at the top. Um, just a brief note that uh, people of African descent also came to be talked about as natural resources. And after slavery, we can note that they were people of African descent were still being used in very deprivatory ways as sharecroppers, lumber people, tenant farmers, etc. And the way they were used and the way that the environment was used was really quite one and the same. And I've gone into that in another chapter of the book. But the thinking of people as resources that can simply be used up, and that was very much the sense of convict laborers, in contradistinction to people who were enslaved, who had a monetary value assigned to them after slavery, when convict which meant that when your crops were coming in, you would have your police people go and arrest all the Black people standing on corners or walking down roads who may have jobs, but may not be, may have found a way to work a little bit for themselves. And they were rounded up as vagrants and criminalized, made as prisoners, and then leased out to white people to bring the harvest in. All right, I think I've talked enough. I'm going to turn it over to you all for some questions and conversations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary. That was incredible and so informative. If anybody has any questions or comments that they'd like to share, we can transition into that now. I'll ask you one thing, Mary, while everybody's getting their questions together. I was wondering if you could just, in the spirit of this particular series, we're asking people a lot about their unique path towards the work that they're doing in the world. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about just like the very early stages of this process for you, either in your current book or just in doing this work in general. What was that like? What kind of barriers did you confront? If you could tell us a little bit about that, and then if anybody has other questions and comments, we'll open it up to the group.
Sure. Well, I'm happy to see a number of people I've worked with at Pacifica on the call. And so I'd spent like 30 years studying colonialism in various places of the world and the way in which it deformed colonialist and the environment too. But I had never gone back to really track it in my own family.
Mm,
And I think that part of being white is there's a lot of specificity amongst us in terms of places where our ancestors came from, the religions they were involved in, their economic classes, etc., that gets sort of erased, and we just have a very vague sense. We also have lost a sense of like place, the places that our people came from, and the places that they settled in the United States.
mhm,
We're left with kind of being people who can easily move from one place to another and don't really have a sense of history that goes back very far at all. And
mhm,
if our families are nuts about genealogy, it might not be radical genealogy or what's called anti-racist genealogy, because genealogy is, for the most part, used to try to find somebody, anybody in one's family that one can laud and glorify, sometimes quite appropriately, so that one feels a little better about oneself. But radical genealogy is really a different thing, a critical genealogy of saying, okay, there were two original sins that came about with the founding of the country, and it was Native American genocide and chattel slavery. We invented a form of slavery that had never been practiced in human history, and that was a form of treating people as property, not only for the entirety of their life, but across generations. And so that's really something as a culture to come to terms with. But I hadn't come to terms with it. I knew I was brought up in New York, but both my parents, my grandparents, my great grandparents were all from Memphis, Tennessee. And one side of the family was demonstrably racist. And so I thought, well, I'll start with that side of the family. Actually, that side of the family didn't come into the South until after the Civil War. And I went to look at my father's family. My father, whom I had never heard utter a racist word, although I found out racist things that he was undoubtedly involved in his own life, but working back his family, generations of people who enslaved people and brought them from one state to the next until the Civil War. So one thing that really helped me was there are amazing groups of white people doing this work. One of them is called Coming to the Table, that also really encourages people reaching out to descendants of enslaved people that your own ancestors enslaved. And that's been very helpful and interesting to me. Also a group called Ancestors and Money that really helps people track where did the money that they may have inherited come from. Maybe not all from slavery, maybe from the pharmaceutical industry or the coal industry or various things. But how do we become accountable for the harms that were created along the way, both to the human beings that worked in those industries and to the environment? They're just a bunch of groups, and I think they're detailed in the chapter that I sent you. So that really was a support for me, and also enabled me to hear hundreds of other people's stories. So I began to get a sense of what are the psychological tasks that a person has to go through to do this kind of work. And I think that's what I talked about last time I was here. So I won't talk about that right now.
Excellent. Yes, for anybody who's interested in hearing more from Mary, she's been on Living One more than once before recently. I think 2 years ago during our series on reparations. So we will include that link in the YouTube posting of this talk so you can hear all of Mary's past appearances on Living One. Thank you so much, Mary. That's really so interesting to hear your arc. And for anybody now who's interested in asking some questions or sharing anything, you can go ahead and use the raise hand option if that's easier, or type in the chat, whatever. Mike, are you? I hear you. um, I'm not sure if you're speaking, but we're hearing some gobbledygook. Mike, something is up with your microphone, so I'm going to mute you. If you could type in the chat if you're trying to ask a question. Um, but we'll open it up if anybody else would like to say something.
I will.
Go right ahead, Gay.
I'll serve as the between question advertisement. Thank you, Mary. It's just so lovely, and congratulations on the completion of your book. It's really quite amazing. I have obviously a list of things, but I'll try to keep it concise. What I guess a couple of the things is I'll just where would you say American Indian genocide, as you were describing, where does that fit in this broader chattel slavery scenario? I mean, and I guess I'll put a little coda on that, um, because I also see this as mapping the genesis or the evolution of United States. I'll just keep it limited, not North America. United States psychology of an identity of colonialism and imperialism. And a second coda on that is that I was also struck by what it seemed to me the kind of meticulousness with which these steps were taken. I don't know if that just reflects your scholarship, but it seemed to me that there were these sort of initial hesitant steps and they kind of spiraled and evolved. So that's like one question with like five.
Okay. Yeah, I had a quote I wanted to read from Powhatan because the question as we go back to this early history is, could it have been different? Could we have done it differently? And so I'm going to read it now. That he was the leader of 32 Algonquin tribes, and he presented this to John Smith as an alternative pathway to peace for the English. He asking them to retreat from war, guns, and swords. He says, "Now I'm grown old and must soon die, and the succession must descend in order to my brothers, and then to my sisters and their daughters. I wish their experience was equal to mine, and that your love to us might not be less than ours to you. Why should you take by force that from us which you can have by love? Why should you destroy us, who have provided you with food? What can you get by war? We can hide our provisions and fly into the woods, and then you must consequently famish by wronging your friends. What is the cause of your jealousy? You see us unarmed and willing to supply your wants. If you will come in a friendly manner, and not with swords and guns, as to invade an enemy. I'm not so simple as not to know it is better to eat good meat, lie well, and sleep quietly with my women and children, to laugh and be merry with the English, and being their friend, to have copper hatchets and whatever else I want, than to fly from all, to lie cold in the woods, feed upon acorns, roots, and trash, and to be so hunted that I cannot rest, eat, or sleep. In such circumstances, my men must watch, and if a twig should but break, all would cry out, 'Here comes Captain Smith.'" So what I found was that every step of my people's migration, and I'm sure everybody else's, first had to do with displacing the Native Americans and then going about eliminating them through violence. And they couldn't come from Virginia into North Carolina until that area had been cleared of Native Americans. They couldn't come from North Carolina into Tennessee until the same thing happened. They couldn't go into Mississippi until the same thing had happened. And so it's a very linked story. And I tell parts of it in the book, but my focus has been the stories are so large. My main focus is really on the slave part, but they're completely linked. What was the second part, Gay?
I don't know. I was trying to get everything into one question.
Let me look at what Mike has said. Today, there's a resistance to teaching woke in schools. Why does such resistance still persist today? And how do we work around this in order to move our society forward in a positive direction? Yes, Mike. And Mike, so good to have you here. Part of writing this book was an intervention on my part into this national dialogue of where we're going to start our history. Are we going to start it in 1619, or are we going to start it in 1776 and pretend that genocide and chattel slavery didn't exist? You could say perhaps I'm too stuck in this history before the Civil War and in the Civil War, but what I see happening is that we've never resolved the Civil War, and that we're continuing to fight some of the very same battles, and that when we try to say that teaching the kind of history I've shared with you today is being woke, and that it would be disturbing to white children, that's a way of perpetuating the kinds of ideas that enslavers had, and not allowing them to be held in the light of day next to the experiences of the people who were enslaved. So how do we, why does such resistance still persist today? Well, I would look to some of these psychological dynamics I'm alluding to, which is people yearning to feel adequate, and to do that by trying to feel better than other people. Like when Trump says that Kamala Harris is unintelligent, I mean, that, to me, that comes straight out of this history that I'm talking about. It's right here with us today, and we have to keep working to keep those books in the libraries, to praise our librarians, to work with our school curriculum, to teach our children and our grandchildren what really happened. And one way to do that in white families is to do a radical genealogy, and to talk very honestly with the kids and grandchildren about what we find out in terms of our linkage to the history that is the history before what they want us to know about.
Mary, what can you say a little bit about now that your book is complete-ish, a little tweaking? Is there a before after effect in terms of your own transformation in that sense, or evolution, or whatever?
Well, I grew up in New York. My family was from Memphis. Up until when I was 10, I would go back and forth in the summertime, and then the aunt that I did that with died. My father died when I was 31, and when I buried him in Memphis, that was the last time I went to the South for 35 years, because I embarked on adopting some daughters, and some of them were of color, and I was not going to take them back to Memphis. So when I started on this book, they were all grown up, and I went back 35 years later, and began to really sit at the gravestones of my family going back 250 years, and find out about them. And in doing that, began to be able to claim places that I'd actually never been to. I'd never really been to Mississippi, never been to northern North Carolina, or the area of Jamestown and Henricus. So as I visited during the course of the book, I gained relationship to parts of history, but also to parts of the land, and to what had happened to the land in the course of the great transformations that were wrought by tobacco and cotton and lumbering in particular, given my own family. So I slowly gathered a sense of belonging to some larger whole that I had not had before. A belonging to history, a belonging to my family, to these places, and also to people in the present who are working in these locations to create a very different future, particularly for African Americans. And that's really the work of reparations. So yes, it was a lot of tragic history to learn about, but I'm so grateful that I did. And I think that there are many working our ways out of racial capitalism and racial hierarchy have many blessings.
Thank you. Did you feel part of that belonging, then, that coming into wholeness that you described? Did your attitudes evolve or change toward your ancestors and even your immediate family?
I'll talk mainly about my ancestors. this last trip to the South, I spent the May in Tennessee and Mississippi. And I went to their grave sites, and I wanted to tell them their role in the book and why I'd written the book, and to some of them why it presents them in a rather not so good light. And I realized that their stones, often you couldn't even really read them. So I did some Googling about how you clean gravestones. And so for a couple of weeks, I just took my toothbrush and brush and Dawn soap and buckets of water, and I would just work on their gravestones, talking with them. And I came to feel like some others before me have said that holding ancestors in disdain will not do, because it creates a false sense of division between them and us, as though they are the unredeemed and we're the redeemed, when in fact so many aspects of this history are still being lived out amongst us today. And so I would say I found ways to care for some of them, and to chat with them. And for some of them, I can tell you nobody had visited them in quite a long time, given the way their gravestones looked.
It reminds me so much of Thich Nhat Hanh's discussion of the continuation. The Father is in the Son, and the Son is in the Father.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for your questions, Gay. Would anyone else like to add or ask anything before we wrap up today? Yeah, Mary.
We can't hear you, Mary. I think you're muted.
I think she's looking for it. It should be on the bottom left.
Can you unmute her, Olivia?
I clicked the ask to unmute, so let me see if I can do it. Um, huh. Um, audio.
You could put your question in the chat, Mary.
I'll just make a further comment, if I may, while this Mary connection happens. But your description, about the psychological, the processes, and the internal kinds of things, very much like that we're describing with nature consciousness. In other words, this mindfulness practice and these kinds of reflective practices and teachings is really that kind of undoing. I would say dissolve, but first in kind of an undoing and then a dissolution of the internal structures, the internal assumptions that are so powerful in that sense of really liberating that particular individual. So, so it's very much in parallel way described with what we're trying to encourage, with our mindfulness and meditation practices and teachings having to do with non-human nature.
Absolutely. And I think all the work around animal rights and the rights of mountains, riverways, etc., earth rights, work at that part of the hierarchy. If those entities and groups of living animals are given rights, then when people try to dehumanize others by likening them to animals, it's not going to work, because all beings have them. Mary, hi.
I'm there. I switched device.
Oh man, we almost had it.
Grandmother came directly from Ireland and met her husband and moved to South Dakota. And the rest of the family are Germans from Russia and went directly to South Dakota. We just bypassed, I don't remember seeing a Black person in South Dakota. They sure well, there were, but the Native Americans is really big. And somebody recently said to me, maybe I should go back there and visit those graves. And I know where cemetery is. I don't know where their land was, because it was farmland that was the railroads, I think, had land to give away to homesteaders, and so people just, got the land, but kind of like a miracle. Like, why? How did the railroads even get the land? I guess the U.S. government took it away from the Native Americans and gave it. It's very complicated, isn't it?
No, that is what happened. Yes.
Yes, and so I really don't know that part because I don't. My family is not a. I don't have a family that's cohesive. I mean, and they're all dead. And so trying to find this information is really tricky. But I thought, well, maybe if I just go there, and go to the land management building or wherever it is, and I could find these places. And I would love to talk to if there are Native Americans around there. I mean, I just feel like a real need to do some reparation.
Yes. Well, Mary, there's so much.
I mean, my family was poor, so they didn't make a lot of money off of it, but they still took their land.
Yes, that's right. And before you go, there is so much you can find out online, online, not on land. I mean, it's amazing how quickly, if you really want to know some things, how quickly you can find it out. It's so available.
It is getting more and more available. I do have a book that does allow me to do some searches online. So yeah. Well, thank you. But I'm really glad to hear that you went and did that. And it sounds like it was very helpful.
It was really helpful.
And I think I carry a lot of their guilt.
A book I can recommend to you is called Healing Haunted Histories by Elaine Innes and Ched Myers. Her ancestors were Mennonites, came from Russia through Ukraine, Saskatchewan, I guess. And then she discovered, that they had taken native land. And the book is a beautiful, it's a beautiful pathway toward healing that. And that she's working on a study guide now that people can use that goes along with it.
Say that title one more time.
Healing Haunted Histories.
Thank you.
I think Olivia just put it in the chat.
Oh, thank you, Olivia. All right. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And if any of you want to be in touch, I'll just put my email in the chat.
Mary, both of you touched on this going back to the land. And I in other words, that there's a quote unquote third party as such, not really, but I think it's so powerful to recognize, the land and where these things happened and what the land was experienced, not just in terms of clear cutting and that destruction, but being witness to, and then going back, Mary, both of you in that sense, I think that is really quite something, and is quite significant to recognize that nature is not just this passive entity, but rather participated in terms of witnessing and all.
Yeah, and how we treated it, was quite how we treated people we deemed below us if we were white. That it was just there for us to use. Didn't matter what it looked like afterwards.
And the other thing that really, of course, it strikes me is the very violent tearing of the connection between the peoples and their home and their land. I mean, I know you probably discussed that in your book, but just the whole idea of being torn away from Africa, and that dislocation and that disorientation, and I'm making assumptions, the inability to really reroute, in that sense.
Yes, and once you came here, your family could be separated at any moment. Your children could be taken away. Your husband could be taken away. You might be sold away. There was no stability to be relied on. And if you were going to love, you had to love across that deep uncertainty.
Could I say one more thing?
Yes.
Yes, so I didn't find out about my family on my father's side until everybody was dead, because they were very silent. But they moved from Germany and were invited by Catherine the Great to Russia, but they remained German and they were in Russia. And then they were treated poorly and they had to leave Russia, and then they came to South Dakota. So they were always this little enclave of these people, but they moved from land to land. And I can't help but think that that also probably caused them that they were such unhappy people, maybe.
Yes, absolutely. Very difficult to be displaced like that multiple times and not to have your community with you, the rest of your extended family with you.
Yeah.
Mary, if I can, I'm going to ask, this is Mary number 3, if I can. I'll ask
Okay,
one
Mary
more
number 3. Yes.
question. I think all of what you talk about, right? We are our past, we are our history genetically, all of those kind of things. And I think the healing of that is so important in this day and age. And you can't be ignorant to it, although we all try to be ignorant to what our past is. And when you made the statement about belonging, that's also so critical, because most of us are longing to belong somewhere, right? So there is a place in our history in which we can belong. My question is this, for those of us, I'm adopted. And so I don't, quote, have my genetic history. I don't know where I need to make reparations. I don't know where I need to write. And yes, I have the family I live, my family, but that's their history. That's not my history. How do I heal that psychological scarring that does exist in me genetically? How do I go about making reparation? I think is something, and it struck me the last time you talked, as I don't know how to do that. There has to be a way, even though I have no way of knowing what that history is. And I know I'm not the only person in this world that has that barrier. And yet it's a barrier that's important to move beyond for my own healing and for what I can do by my healing out in the world. And so any thoughts or ideas on that would be very helpful.
It's something I think about quite a lot, because my children are adopted, right? And they're adopted from other countries, as well. And I have some knowledge of some of their ancestral past, but that I've passed to them, of course, but not all that much. And so in doing this work, I've gone back in my family, but is it relevant to my own children, my own adopted children, what I've done? Peripherally, but not centrally. But what I will say is that, I'm not a genealogist, but I did my best in finding the way back. But at many points I thought, it doesn't really matter if this is completely accurate genealogically, because what I'm doing is using these ancestors to learn about a period of history of what was happening around them and what people like them were involved in. I don't know if that helps, but I don't think we need to have literal ancestors to really be able to take this history in. We know that if we have grown up as white, we know this history has to do with us. But what is it? What is it specifically? And you can't, if you have no idea how, like, what part of the country your great grandmother lived in, it is a loss. But you can go from where you're living right now. You can go the school, the universities that you attended, your faith group, if you have one, and work backwards in history. I could have written a whole book just from growing up on Long Island. I'm in New York City right now, Long Island, because these racial dynamics live themselves out in my neighborhood, in my school, in my university, for sure. So that would be another way of doing it. And I was going to have a chapter about that in the book, but I was exceeding my word limit for sure. But start right where you are, the history of your town, of your state.
Yeah, and I think that's great feedback, Mary, in that you don't always have to know the specific. You just need to know what was in that period in time, because no matter what my family or whomever was engaged in what was going on at that point in time, and you can make reparation and do healing from that place. So I appreciate that. That's great feedback.
Thanks.
Thank you for your question, Jenny, Mary, Mary number 3, Mary number 2, Kay, and everybody. It's been really fabulous to be here with all of you today. Mary Watkins, thank you so much for spending all this time with us and sharing all of your wisdom and insight. It's been really inspirational and fascinating. So thank you so much. It's been great.
Thank you for having me. Thanks everybody for coming. Good to see you here. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Our next Living One speaker will be 1 week from today on November 8th at 10 a.m. Pacific time. We will welcome Liza Horan, who is on a mission to help people discover and express their unique proposition, personally and professionally, for greater impact to themselves and others. If you enjoy Living One and feel called to support Kerulos, Living One, and all of our sanctuary residents, please consider donating at the link on our website, kerulos.org. Once again, thank you everybody for being here with us today. We'll see you next week.